Well, now we get into the much more local conversation. So can I invite Vincent Rigby to the stage, please? Vincent is the chair of the Senior Arctic Officials, and he is Canadian, of course. We look forward to hearing your perspective.
President Grimson, Prime Minister Gulagson, President Nisto, fellow speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It gives me great pleasure to be here today in Reykjavik and to be participating in the second Arctic Circle Assembly. And I want to congratulate Iceland, and in particular its president, for initiating and hosting this forum. This is an important gathering, and Canada is very, very pleased to be a part of it. As the chairman of the Senior Arctic Officials, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity this morning to speak to you about the Arctic Council, about its impressive body of work that spans almost 20 years, its strengths and its accomplishments, and the important work that it is doing to promote sustainable development and environmental protection in the Arctic. I've been on the job now for about 4 months. I've had a chance to travel to Canada's north, to Iqaluit, at the beginning of September for the inaugural meeting of the Arctic Economic Council, and also most recently last week in Yellowknife for my first meeting as chair of the Senior Arctic Officials. And I'd like to share with you this morning some of my initial impressions. And I'd like to also mention that the Honourable Leona Gluklak, who is the distinguished chair of the Arctic Council and Canada's Minister for the Arctic Council, could not be here today. However, she asked me to convey her warm greetings to all participants. Let me begin by stating the obvious. The global interest in the Arctic, in its people, its environment, and its prospects for economic and social development is currently unparalleled. I need only look around this room at this impressive and diverse expert audience to see that. You're all here today because you have knowledge and ideas to share and a keen interest in what happens in the Arctic. And part of this interest no doubt stems from the monumental changes that are currently happening in this region. These changes are leading to new and exciting opportunities, both for growth and for prosperity, but they are also leading to a number of new challenges, including social and environmental. As the leading intergovernmental forum for cooperation on Arctic issues since its establishment in 1996, the Arctic Council must do its part to address these changes and to seize these opportunities in the best interests of Northerners. The Council's governance structure contributes greatly to its success and its ability to respond to the changing Arctic. Here I'm specifically referring to the unique feature of the Council, where the 6 Indigenous permanent participant organizations not only sit at the table with the 8 Arctic states, but also contribute actively to the decision-making process, and they play a leadership role on important initiatives. The permanent participants are what connects the Council to Arctic Indigenous peoples and communities. I saw this firsthand at the Senior Arctic Officials meeting last week, where permanent participants brought valued perspectives and insights to the table. And I'd be remiss if I did not also mention that many accredited observer states and organizations, that they are increasingly making valuable contributions to the Council's working groups and to their task forces. For example, Germany, which has been an observer since the very year the Council was established in 1996, has a long-standing interest in Arctic scientific research and has recently been involved in the Council's work to address black carbon and methane emissions that affect the Arctic region. And Singapore, one of the Council's newest observers, has been contributing to the development of a plan to enhance Arctic migratory bird conservation along the Eurasian Flyway. These are both excellent examples of how observer action can enhance the Council's efforts. Since its inception, the Council has carried out focused scientific assessment work to address a variety of sustainable development and environmental protection issues facing the Arctic. I've been struck in my time as SAO chair by the quality and volume of products related to both the natural and social sciences, some of which are truly groundbreaking. These range from the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment and the Arctic Human Development Report, which were both done in 2004, to the 2009 Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, and most recently to the 2013 Arctic Biodiversity Assessment, just to name a few. These assessments have not only helped build our collective knowledge and understanding of the Arctic region, but have led to recommendations to help guide states in the development of their Arctic policies. And while this important assessment work continues to be at the core of the Council's activities, the Council is also evolving and undertaking new activities that help influence and that help shape policy. This includes more of an emphasis on recommendations for action, and as mentioned earlier this this morning, also the development of legally binding agreements, such as the 2011 agreement on maritime search and rescue cooperation and the 2013 agreement on cooperation in marine oil pollution preparedness and response, both of which were signed by all Arctic states under the auspices of the Council. We've been witnessing a gradual, and I would say necessary, evolution of the Arctic Council over the last 18 years. And why is this necessary? Because as the people of the Arctic learn to adapt to the changes taking place in the region, the Council must also adapt its work and priorities to address new challenges effectively and to seize upon the new opportunities that change is bringing to the region. And under Canada's chairmanship theme, Development for the People of the North, we're aiming to do precisely that. I fully expect that one of Canada's legacies, one of the things that will be remembered for as Arctic Council Chair, will be the greater focus that is placed on the human dimension of Arctic Council activities. We set out to ensure that during our chairmanship, the Council undertakes concrete, results-oriented activities that help address the changes that are occurring and provide real benefits for the people, the actual people on the ground who live in the region. Canada consulted widely across the Arctic in the preparation of its chairmanship priorities, and this is what we came away with. The best example of this is seen in our flagship initiative to create a new circumpolar business forum, the Arctic Economic Council. This is an independent body led by the private sector and officially founded in early September, and it will help to ensure that businesses of all sizes across the Arctic region work together to facilitate Arctic-to-Arctic trade and investment and do so in a responsible and a sustainable manner. We're looking forward to seeing the Arctic Economic Council create its own legacy over the coming years as it works to increase the prosperity of Arctic communities, and we're very happy to see that its executive committee will be meeting on the margins of this conference in the next couple of days. In addition to the AEC, other priority initiatives are furthering this increased focus on the human dimension. For example, we are exploring ways to promote the traditional ways of life of Arctic inhabitants, and we are developing recommendations on how to better incorporate traditional knowledge into the Council's work across all of its priorities. Some Arctic states, including Canada, the US, and the Kingdom of Denmark, already include traditional knowledge in legislation because it leads to better end results in science and research, and we recognize that the Council work could benefit as well. We're also working to support the well-being of Arctic residents, including efforts to promote mental wellness, prevent suicides, and increase the resilience of circumpolar communities. On the environment, we are building on the Council's extensive work in dealing with climate change in the Arctic. A special task force is developing actions to reduce black carbon and methane emissions, realizing both health and climate benefits. And we are also creating an online climate change adaptation portal so that Northerners, researchers, and policymakers can share experiences and share best practices. And recognizing the importance of pollution prevention, the Council is also developing an action plan to prevent marine oil pollution that could arise from increased shipping and oil and gas activities right across the region. All of this work is helping to make sure that the Council continues to be relevant, that it continues to be responsive, and that it continues to be effective. And in talking to people over the last several months, I'm convinced that this approach continues to garner tremendous support. And we are looking forward to highlighting these priority initiatives along with the rest of the Council's accomplishments during Canada's chairmanship at a showcase event in Ottawa on April 23rd and at the ministerial meeting to be held in Iqaluit on April 24th and 25th. And if last week's SAO meeting in Yellowknife is any indication of the progress we're making on some of the important initiatives I've just been discussing, then I feel we're going to have a highly successful ministerial meeting. And it's at the Iqaluit Ministerial that Canada will pass the torch over to the United States, which will then commence its second two-year term at the Council's helm. No doubt you will hear more on the program the U.S. is planning for the Council when Admiral Papp takes the podium a little bit later this morning. We got a bit of a taste test, if I can call it that, at the SAO meeting last week in Yellowknife. I have to say that the U.S. program is exciting, it's ambitious, and I'm very glad to see that it builds on a lot of Canada's emphasis on helping to improve the economic and living conditions of Northern residents. Before closing, I'd like to reflect for a moment on where the Council has come from and where it is going to in the future. Cooperation among natives and among nations and peoples has been the hallmark of the Council over the past 18 years. It's at its very core. And going forward, especially in this time of profound change in the region, we must continue to work together and to learn from each other. Each Arctic state is a temporary steward of the Council during its two-year chairmanship. But of course, the work that needs to be done doesn't stop after those 2 years have passed. All members of the Council know that to make a real difference, we need to continue to take a longer-term view of our work and build a stronger Council and a better Council. I witnessed this dedication and commitment at last week's meeting in Yellowknife, which I have to say was truly, truly inspiring. And I believe this is how we will achieve real results for the benefit of the people who call this region their home. As the Council approaches its 20th anniversary, we should aim for nothing less. Again, I'm looking forward to participating in Arctic Circle discussions over the coming days, which I believe can play an important role in advancing the Arctic dialogue at a truly critical time. And it's also a role that is complementary, very complementary to the work of the Arctic Council. And I look forward to working with all of you in the remaining months of Canada's Arctic Council chairmanship and well into the future in making a difference in the Arctic region. Many thanks.
And now, with pleasure, we're going to have question time. So I can bring you over here. We'll sit down. This is a mic for you. But I'm going to take my squatter's rights and ask the first question. Tell me what your one distilled message would be for the U.S. residents of the Arctic, having been through all of the startup processes that you all have had to undertake. What would you most like to see carried on to benefit the U.S. residents?
It is on.
It's on.
I think that's an excellent question. I've had a chance to go down to Washington and discuss the transition from the Canada to the U.S. chairmanship with Admiral Papp and with other U.S. colleagues. As I said earlier, we got a great presentation at the SAO meeting by the U.S. SAO last week on U.S. priorities moving forward. And I'm really encouraged by what I see in U.S. priorities. I think that there'll perhaps be a slightly different emphasis than what we've seen in the Canadian chairmanship up to this point in terms of maybe a little bit more about climate change and in some other areas. But I think at the end of the day, the continuity of the Arctic Council is extremely important. And I would hope to see, not just for Alaskan residents, but for northern residents, Indigenous communities, northerners generally, a continuation of some of those Canadian priorities in terms of putting people front and center in the north. And so continued emphasis on traditional knowledge and local knowledge, emphasis on mental wellness, on suicide prevention, which I think the American chairmanship will take on, sanitation, and economic development. And I think that the Arctic Economic Council, again, I think is going to be, from our point of view, a flagship initiative. Mm-hmm. And what we've been hearing in our consultations, and I know the American leadership has been consulting very actively with the Alaskan people, so they've been listening and will incorporate their ideas into their chairmanship priorities. But we've heard again and again and again that sustainable economic development is truly critical for Northerners, and that there are two pillars to Arctic Council activities. There is the climate change pillar, and then there's also the sustainable development piece, yeah. And you need both of those. Yeah. So we would like to see a continued emphasis on both.
Thank you. It's a very telling answer, because as I listen to these welcoming remarks from heads of state and people from around the world who look at the Arctic but don't reside in the Arctic, there's very clearly a bifurcated sense of priorities. There's a sense of climate change and its effects on the world as we see through the Arctic, and then there is a sense that the people in the Arctic on the ground may have more pressing and different needs than those who are outside. So,
but I have to say, that they're not mutually exclusive. And so environmental protection on the one side and sustainable development on the other, these are actually mutually reinforcing, we would say. And you can't have one without the other at the end of the day. So I think they're very, very complementary. And that's why they're enshrined in the Ottawa Declaration of 1996 as those two fundamental pillars, because they do feed off one another. So they're both important.
Audience members, who has the first question? Right there.
Michael Byers from the University of British Columbia. I'd like to follow up on this last question. Canada is the only country to have formally renounced the Kyoto Protocol. And the Canadian federal government has also conspicuously failed to regulate carbon dioxide emissions from the oil and gas sector, which is growing very quickly in Canada. So my question for Mr. Rigby is, has the Canadian government's lack of leadership on climate change impeded your efforts and that of your predecessor in terms of showing leadership in the Arctic Council in a region that is on the front lines of climate change?
I think if you look at the record of Canada's chairmanship over the last couple of years, and you'll see this at the ministerial in the spring as well, that while we put a lot of emphasis on sort of the human dimension, as I characterized it in my speech, there's been a lot of work on the climate change side as well. And so if you look at the work we're doing in our task force on black carbon and methane, if you're looking at the work we're doing in terms of setting up a adaptation portal, there's a longer list of specific activities. I think we've still more than held our own in terms of climate change activities within the Arctic Council, and we will continue to do that. So I certainly would not want to leave the impression that Canada, under its chairmanship, has focused exclusively on one side of the paradigm to the exclusion of the other. Not at all. And I think that people will see that when the deliverables are announced in the spring of 2015.
Okay, next question.
First, thank you, Mr. Rigby, for being here and your work with the Arctic Council. I just have a question regarding what you mentioned about building a stronger council and a better council. What does that mean, I guess, or what does that look like in terms of the inclusivity of the council, or perhaps more or less being exclusive? I was wondering if you could explain a little bit further about what you meant by a better and stronger council.
I think that, in terms of inclusiveness, I think the Arctic Council already is very inclusive. When you look at the fact that, as I mentioned, you have 8 states and then 6 permanent participants, and I talked about this unique feature and how important it is. You look at 32 observer states and NGOs and IGOs at the Yellowknife meeting last week. Everybody was there together in the room. It was quite something. I've been to a lot of international conferences. I've chaired a lot of international processes over the years. And as was mentioned earlier, this was quite something, having everybody in the room at the same time. So that is certainly welcome. A stronger Arctic Council, I think we're looking at a number of things. Some of them are quite administrative in terms of really establishing or strengthening the Arctic Council Secretariat that is in Tromsø in Norway, better records management, better archiving, better outreach in terms of a communication strategy. I think that one of the things that we're going to be most proud of, and it sounds very administrative in nature, but we've actually got a tracking chart now of all Arctic Council commitments. So all the working groups and all the task forces, over 80 projects and programs going on at any one time, we have a tracking chart that basically is an update on all those projects, when they're going to be finished, what the timelines are, what they're going to achieve, and we're going to make that public. We're going to actually attach that to the SAO report to ministers in the spring, so everybody can hold the Arctic Council accountable for its actions. And so we think this is a big deal. We're quite proud of it. We're still working on it, more to come. But it is, I think it's going to be, again, it sounds rather administrative in nature, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to have some big impact.
Okay. Lady in the pink.
Yes, lady in pink. Maria Mork, a resident of Iceland. I have a question and a remark. Most of the speakers this morning have mentioned the natural resources that are to be found in the Arctic, and most of them also mention oil. Now, I have a question concerning what is being done for renewable solutions in the Arctic already. Most of the things that we are talking about here are business as usual. And then people come and say, we have very good cleanup mechanisms. I would like to see preventive measures, and I would like to ask simply, which preventive measures have been taken already? Because business is actually starting. as usual in the area. So please comment on that. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I can't go into detail on what has happened up to this point. I can speak to my experience and what the Arctic Council is working on at the moment. And certainly, when it comes to development of oil resources and so on, and prevention of oil spills, that is something that one of the council working groups is actually focusing on at the moment and coming up with an action plan of sort of concrete actions that the council can take in terms of preventing oil spills and really focusing on that dimension. I mean, I think the other piece to look at is in terms of responsible resource development is that I won't speak for the Arctic Economic Council here. It's an independent body led by the private sector, but I think that the work that they're going to be conducting is very much going to focus on the responsible side of resource development and not just sort of a purely commercial dimension. So I think you're going to see some of the work coming out of there as well, focusing on some of the issues that you've talked about.
Yes, on this side.
I've been asked to mention that I'm also the last question for this session here. So my name is Jared Westlink. I'm the Associate Executive Director of the Youth Arctic Coalition. One of the sayings that I kind of go by is that youth are not only leaders of tomorrow, but we're leaders of today. And I know Canada in the past has mentioned its want to engage youth in the Arctic Council and in Arctic issues. So I would like to ask Mr. Rigby how he envisions that happening, both youth being and staying involved in what the Arctic Council is doing, as well as being and staying involved in, as President Grimson says, the Arctic village that we find ourselves in today.
Thank you very much. And you and I had a chance to chat briefly yesterday, and I'm hoping you're going to come see me when you come back to Ottawa, so we can talk about this in more detail. But yes, absolutely, such a large proportion of the population in the north is made up of youth, and this is the future of the Arctic. So when we talk about sustainable development over generations, it's the region's youth that are going to be front and center in that regard. At the meeting in Yellowknife last week, this came up on a number of occasions, and I had actually said to my SAO colleagues and my permanent participant colleagues that we should be looking at a broader youth engagement strategy for the council. And so this is something that I'd like to put a priority on. Canada is only going to be in the chair for the next 6 months or so, but certainly I would pass that on to my U.S. colleagues and my other Arctic Council colleagues that we need a more coherent, sort of cogent strategy looking at youth engagement activities and youth engagement outreach. There'll be a couple of announcements at the ministerial in the spring. I won't steal the thunder right now of ministers, but I think that broader strategy is necessary, and I'm certainly going to encourage SAOs and permanent participants to take that on in the remaining time as chair.
Thank you. And thank you all. We are going to end this question and answer period, go on to our representatives from the United States, and then have more questions. Thank you very much.